Okay, Chapter 6, Emergency Code Red. "What is that child doing?" Mr. Tabby asked as Victoria barreled up the front stoop, her baseball cap bouncing against her frizzy red hair. Ben knew exactly what Victoria was doing. She wanted to see the dragon. "Victoria!" Pearl yelled. "Come back here!" "Victoria!" Mrs. Mulberry screeched. "Be a good girl and tell Dr. Wu that your mummy wants to meet her." "This is an unfortunate turn of events," Mr. Tabby said, shaking his head. "Trespassing can lead to all sorts of unpleasant situations." "We have to stop her." Pearl darted around Mr. Tabby and raced up the driveway, gravel crunching beneath her sneakers. Ben had worried about Mrs. Mulberry getting inside, but it turned out that Victoria was just as sneaky. He squeezed past Mr. Tabby and took off at full sprint, but before he was even halfway up the driveway, Victoria's red overalls disappeared through the front door. Pearl could run like the wind, but she hadn't been fast enough, and Victoria was inside. Say anything? Say. Ben's mind raced with all sorts of dreadful outcomes. When he had first visited the hospital, he accidentally had let the Sasquatch escape. The Sasquatch had spent the afternoon riding in a grocery cart and eating pudding at the senior center. And thanks to the Sasquatch catching kit, the kids had been able to return the big, hairy beast to the hospital before any of the people in Buttonville had noticed. But what if Victoria let something worse escape? Something that made a lot of noise or had a hankering for flesh instead of pudding. Not every imaginary creature was as nice as the Sasquatch. Ben pumped his arms as fast as he could. Once he dashed up the stairs, he glanced over his shoulder. Somehow Mr. Tabby had managed to get both Mrs. Mulberry and the red wagon back onto the sidewalk. The gate was closed and the padlock. Mr. Tabby was hurrying toward the hospital. "Victoria, be careful!" Mrs. Mulberry yelled. Ben raced through the doorway. The lobby looked as it always did. The old button factory sign leaned against one wall, and dusty cobwebs sparkled in the corners of the ceiling. There was a door marked "Employees Only" and another marked "Identification Room." But Victoria was nowhere to be seen. Ben nearly jumped out of his skin as the siren sounded and a nasal voice blasted from the wall speaker. "Emergency code red, emergency code red. Unauthorized humans on the loose, secure all areas." Pearl stood at the far end of the lobby, pounding on the closed elevator doors. "Victoria, come back!" "I know there's a dragon on the roof," Victoria's muffled voice sounded from inside the elevator. "And I want to see it. You can't stop me." Ben, leaning over, rested his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. The elevator doesn't go up that far, he realized. And the elevator didn't go to the roof. It didn't go to the 10th floor either, which housed the magical portal, the transportation device that linked the hospital to the imaginary world. But that was the only good news, because there were 8 other floors where Victoria could get into plenty of trouble. The elevator hummed as its panel lit up. Hello. As its panel lit up, it began to drift away from the number 1 and toward the number 2. Victoria was on the move. "Mr. Tabby!" Pearl cried as he hurried into the lobby. A strand of his long red hair had fallen out of place. "She's in there!" Pearl pointed to the elevator. "Chasing children is not part of my job description," Mr. Tabby said grumpily as the arrow moved past number 2. Mr. Tabby hastily shoved one of his keys into the elevator panel. The arrow stopped moving, but it landed on the number 3. "Uh-oh," Ben said. And while Pearl and Ben had never been on 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, or even 9th floors of the hospital, They had been to the 3rd floor many times. It was called the Forest Suite because it was a living forest, complete with trees, frogs, and even a babbling brook. It was where the Sasquatch currently resided while being treated for various ailments like foot fungus and a flea infestation. If Victoria stepped onto the forest suite, there was no telling what might happen. Emergency code red, emergency code red, the nasal voice repeated. Unauthorized human on 3rd floor. Mr. Tabby always kept his cool, even when faced with situations like percolating pixies and runaway Sasquatch. I shall take the back stairs. You two will remain here, he told Ben and Pearl. Pearl groaned, but Mr. Tabby's response was neither a growl from his throat. Pearl closed her mouth and nodded. He pressed his palm to the security pad. The employee's only door clicked open and then he disappeared, the door closing behind him. Neither Ben nor Pearl had been given security clearance, so they were stuck in the waiting room as instructed. He seems to be in an extra cranky mood today, Ben noted. Who can blame him? Pearl said. That Victoria makes me so mad. I hope the Sasquatch scares the daylights out of her. And then she paused and snickered. Maybe it'll even chase her up a tree. Ben, on the other hand, began to pace. Whether or not Victoria got tread was the least of their worries. It felt more like total failure. If he hadn't been distracted by the worm examination, then Victoria wouldn't currently be on the 3rd floor learning all sorts of secrets that could ruin Dr. Wu. He felt kind of sweaty again. Was that the nerves, or was that the mysterious illness? Unauthorized human secured, the nasal voice announced from the speaker. Emergency code deactivated. Woohoo! Pearl cried. He caught her. The elevator made a grinding sound, and the panel lit up as the elevator started to descend. Floor 2, floor 1. Ben and Pearl waited, both shuffling anxiously as if they had to go to the bathroom, and then the doors opened. Mr. Tabby stood inside. A few strands of hair were out of place. He must have run up the back staircase. He held tightly to Victoria's arm. She looked mostly the same. Her frizzy hair, her thick glasses perched on her nose, except she was as pale as the moon. Victoria mumbled as Mr. Tabby led her into the lobby. She looks scared, Ben whispered to Pearl. She looks weird, Pearl said. What's the matter with her face? Under normal circumstances, that particular question would have been considered very rude. But Victoria did look weird. Not only had her face turned as pale as the moon, but it was almost as if it was getting even more round like the moon as well. In fact, it was getting rounder by the minute. Victoria stammered, and her neck began to swell. Ew, what's wrong with her? Pearl asked. I shall explain momentarily. In the meantime, I will escort her back to her mother. And keeping a firm grip on Victoria's arm, he led her outside. Ben and Pearl followed down the long driveway. Mrs. Mulberry was waiting behind the gate. What happened? She called. Did you meet Dr. Wu? What is she like? Oh, tell me everything. Mr. Tabby unlocked the gate gently, but pushed Victoria onto the sidewalk next to her mother with Mrs. Mulberry shrieking. Ah! What is the matter with my baby? What's the matter with her face? And after smoothing a few wrinkles from his vest, Mr. Tabby looked at Mrs. Mulberry, and with a sneer of disapproval. Your daughter was trespassing, and trespassing can lead to all sorts of unpleasant outcomes. Unpleasant? Mrs. Mulberry jabbed a finger at Mr. Tabby. Why is her head so round? I demand an explanation. Ben shuffled nervously, wondering what sort of story Mr. Tabby would come up with. The assistant cleared his throat and stood very straight. He stared down his nose and spoke in a calm manner, as if having one's head expand was nothing at all to worry about. Well, it would appear that your daughter is ill. I suggest you take her home and put her to bed. Big, Victoria said, finally forming a word. Furry. Ben cringed. Big and furry could only mean one thing. She had seen the Sasquatch. But what was happening to her? Both he and Pearl gasped as they took steps back as Victoria's neck grew even bigger. Victoria tried to talk, but no more words came out. Ben couldn't believe what he was seeing, even after everything that he had been exposed to at Dr. Wu's hospital. And in the imaginary world, Victoria's swollen head was the weirdest thing he had seen yet. Well, she's blowing up like a balloon, Mrs. Mulberry cried. The swelling is most unfortunate, Mr. Tabby's pupils flashed. However, all good things must come to an end, and our business here is now concluded. We'd better get to the doctor, Mrs. Mulberry said. The real doctor, not some fake worm doctor. And she pushed Victoria into the red wagon and began pulling it up the street toward town. And good day, Mr. Tabby said with a little wave of his hand. Something happened inside your hospital, Mrs. Mulberry yelled over her shoulder. And as soon as Victoria's face deflates, I'm going to find out exactly what it was. And once the Mulberrys were out of earshot, Pearl broke into a string of questions. Did she get to see the Sasquatch? Did it chase her up a tree? What would happen if she tells everyone? How come her face looked like that? Will she be that way forever? She was the Princess of Buttonville in last year's parade, and I don't think she can be a princess again if her head is as big as a balloon. What do you think? Mr. Tabby held up a hand to silence Pearl. Both she and Ben were quiet, waiting for his answer. Whether or not Victoria is a princess in a parade is the least of our worries. There is another matter of which we must attend. For when that human child stepped out of the elevator and into the forest suite, she entered an area that is currently under quarantine. Quarantine? Ben's stomach tightened. That means it's off limits because someone is sick. Is the Sasquatch sick? Does it have the same thing that Dr. Wu has? Is it bad? Mr. Tabby nodded. The Sasquatch and Dr. Wu are both ill with troll tonsillitis. Your acquaintance is showing early symptoms. Unfortunately, the infection is not only unpleasant, it is also highly contagious. I predict that troll tonsillitis will spread throughout all of Buttonville in just a matter of a few hours. Chapter 7, Troll Tonsillitis.